So welcome everybody to today's little workshop. Today we're here to share some stories and some insights around what is driving children's behaviour, and then to give you some simple and very actionable strategies that you can take away from this workshop and implement with your children this afternoon or tomorrow. So working with children's behaviour can be really challenging, and there are some simple things that we can all do as adults in relationships with children that can make a real difference to the everyday lived experience and reclaim the peace and the relationships that you seek to have with your young children. The first question I'd like to ask is, what is it that you would like your child to be like when they actually grow up? What are the sorts of attributes and things that you would like to think your child can demonstrate as a young adult? I'd like you to think, wind that back. What does independence look like when you're 3? And often those big behaviours are the foundations of the very things that as parents we're aspiring for our children to actually be confident and really capable of doing in a social environment. So I think we need to consider that those are the things that we need to begin to think about when we're looking at what is appropriate behaviour and what is stuff that we really think as problematic. And remembering that our children are still really quite young. So when you're thinking about supporting and guiding children's big behaviours, there's a couple of things that I'd like you to think about. That you can actually be really successful in this space, and that there are a few simple things about respectful relationships that make a difference to how your child actually develops social competence. So when we're thinking about the role as a parent and how we guide children's bigger behaviours, and recognising that children's behaviours when they're in those early years can be quite challenging. When we put in place those simple things like respectful relationships and some simple strategies, we can actually start to move towards the type of relationship that you aim to have with your children, and to be able to support them to become socially competent in the wider social world. There are a few things that when parents are faced with those really challenging types of behaviours day in and day out, that it's easy to lose sight of the fact of some of these really simple fundamentals. And one of them, of course, is that our children in this age group have only been here with us on earth for a very short period of time. They're still very developmentally very young. And I think we need to keep our expectations very realistic as a result of that. It doesn't mean that children get a leave pass for behaviours that are not okay. Mum's looking at you, not that you would do any of those things, I'm sure. But it is about making sure that our expectations are developmentally okay. You'll often see parents have high expectations of their first child, their oldest child, or teachers have expectations of children when there's younger children in the room, that's for some reason older children are supposed to be so much more grown up about coping with the social world. And that's okay to have expectations of children, but it's also really important that they're at least realistic in the beginning part of that. The other part that I want to just keep reminding adults that are working with children is about making sure that children's basic needs are being met. And by that I mean, we know that if children are tired or hungry or unwell, then they can't cope with the social world. I'm quite sure you've had days where you've turned up to work and you haven't been quite yourself because you're under the weather, you're not well. And I think sometimes it's important that we remember that those things still apply for children as much as they do for adults. So when children's behaviour is sliding off and it's not acceptable, just check in. Is your little one tired? Is that a factor that is an easy fix? Don't place overt expectations on children that are tired, overly hot, uncomfortably cold or unwell. And you'll find that sometimes that'll de-escalate issues before they even begin. From the child's perspective, and this is a really important one for adults to consider, and that is the behaviour that you're seeing, the behaviour that you're finding troubling. Ask yourself, is there something that by doing this particular behaviour children are actually avoiding or getting? And sometimes that gives us a really clear insight into potentially the things that we can do to replace the behaviour and meet the need. And of course the biggest need that all children have is the relationship that they have with you and time spent in relationship. How many parents here have had the notion or heard their own parents speak of it a lot about children attention-seeking behaviours? And we think that that's really not okay. The point, of course, is that children have an inherent desire and drive to seek our attention. It's one of the ways in which children have bonded relationships. The way that they go about that can sometimes be really problematic. And it's about understanding if it's a need for time spent in relationship, all we have to do is actually replace the poor behaviour or the stuff that's problematic for an adult with something else that still meets the child's need. And the avoidance one is another one. It's really helpful to remember. By doing something, what is it that the child is potentially avoiding? If you can de-escalate the stress around the thing that the child is trying to avoid, you'll often find that the behaviour that's bugging you starts to dissipate. So they're really important reflective questions as you move to working more in a proactive place with children rather than working in a reactive space where you feel like you lurch from one behavioural episode to the next to the next. This is about how we get proactive about supporting children's behaviour. The other one that I'd like you to think about is this notion around skill and fluency deficits with children's behaviour. All behaviour is learned, and all behaviour has skills, actual skills. And if children don't know the skills of what it takes to share or take turns or be gentle, then they're behind the eighth ball before they even begin in being able to do that behaviour well. So we need to understand where we need to teach the skills around the behaviours that we're seeking to see. And we also need to understand that children, when they're learning a new skill, tend not to be able to do it every time to perfection. Much like sport, you don't start taking up football and be an ace player in your first season. There is a time and a learning curve that supports how we cement learning and skill acquisition. So when you're thinking about the behaviours that are bugging you about your children, start to break it down and think, what are the skills that might be actually missing? And am I giving them time to build the capability to do this skill over and over and over? So the repeatability of skills can often get in the way. And the other one that's really important from an adult perspective, if we're going to move away from being reactive with children's behaviour to being the behavioural coach for children and teaching the appropriate behaviours that we want to see, we need to make sure that our expectations are really clear for children. And often when you're talking with adults working with children's behaviour, they're anything but that. So a clear expectation is a real leadership skill when you're working with children's behaviour. When we say things to children that are vague and not clear, we shouldn't be all that surprised when they can't actually complete the very behaviour that we're actually seeking to do. And I'll give you an example of, no one here has teenagers, no? But if you ask a teenager to go tidy their room, their idea of tidy their room and your idea of tidy the room will likely to be very, very different. And it's no different with the behaviours that we're asking children to do as well when they're younger. So when we're saying things like go and tidy your room, replacing that with something that is much more specific is much more likely to get compliance to the questions and requests that you're making of children. So for instance, instead of saying go and tidy the toy room, be specific. Say, Timothy, I need you to go and put the trucks on the shelf and the books on the bookcase. And that way Timothy's got very little wiggle room to decide that he doesn't want to do what you're asking him to do, and that you're on the same page around what you're expecting that behaviour to actually look like. So when we're talking about expectations, that's that leadership space around working with children rather than just being the person in the relationship at that moment. Has everyone worked with someone that they would consider to be a really strong leader themselves, adult to adult? So when that really strong positive role model around leadership was working with you, I can just about guarantee that when they asked you to do something, it wasn't vague. It was really specific and you knew exactly what it was that they wanted you to actually do. And it's the same when you're working with children's behaviour. The more specific information that you can provide for children about what you want them to be doing, you increase the likelihood of the child's ability to actually be successful in demonstrating that very behaviour. Does that make sense? So some other important considerations before we drop into some real life strategies that you can try with children is a couple of things, and we need that to recognise that all behaviour is learned. So it's not an inherent thing that children are born, and we no longer live in centuries where children were deemed to be born evil. They're born with the ability to learn, and behaviour is a learned response. Good, bad or indifferent, they've learnt it from a reinforcement of the things that they're doing in the social world. The good news for us as adults working with children is everything that can be learned can be taught. And this is a space where adults need to step into the breach. They need to see their role as a teacher and behavioural coach for children. It's really, really important. The clear expectations are really essential. So whatever the behaviour is that you're finding problematic at the moment, stop thinking about the behaviour that you don't want to see and start thinking more about the specific behaviours that you want to see. And then you start to see the roadmap as that behavioural teacher and coach around how you can make it clearer for your little one to be compliant to the very things that you're asking them to do. Simple rules that are visually cued are really important. So don't make 100,000, you don't need 100 flowers blooming for rules. You need to make rules about the things that are your hot buttons and where the child is really struggling. So not what you want to see children stop doing, but rather what you want to see them begin to do. So you'll often hear parents be really, really vague about their rules and expectations with children. Have you heard yourself or have you heard other parents saying things like to children, can you just knock it off? Yeah? Have you ever had that said to yourself as a child? Probably you can remember. Well, that's really, really vague for children. What does that even mean? And particularly children who are struggling to know how the rules of engagement in the social world really work. Have you heard parents sort of say things like, stop whinging? Well, that might be an expression of your own wish list, if they would stop fighting, if they would stop whinging, if they would stop being rough. But it doesn't provide children with the clear directions around what they should be doing instead. So instead of saying stop whinging, using something like saying, we use our big words when you want something from mummy, helps the child to understand what it is that you're trying to seek for them to do. So it's really important. The visual cueing is also really good for very young children. So using clip art on cards to sort of say, this is what my rules look like, sound like, and feel like. It's a really good framework to think of from an adult's perspective about how we make our rules really clear and actionable for children. So replacing things like stop, often in classrooms you'll hear rules like stop running. The parents will say stop running. But when we're saying stop running, what we're actually really wanting children to do is walk instead, for instance. But if we're not specific, you'll often have children, particularly literal children, who will start jumping instead and be able to turn around to you and sort of say, I'm not running, I'm actually jumping. Part of that ambiguity about working with children in that space is exactly the more that you get specific about what it is that you're seeking your child to be able to do, the more you increase the chance to be successful in that space. And routines are the same. Lots of children need to have a clear understanding around how the day is going to unfold. If they're particularly anxious about mums and dads leaving, those sorts of things, then mapping it out with stickmen figures and times chunks of day really help for children to see the predictability about when mums and dads might be returning. And it gives them a sense of ownership in that space so that they're not anxious and they can predict and own their own destiny a little bit more than when it all just feels very vague and they don't know what's going on. It would be like if you went on holidays without an itinerary, but most of us like if we're going on holidays to have some idea of where we're going to start, the things we're going to see and where we might be going to finish our trip. And if we think about how unsettled we would feel if we had no idea, we were just going to get on a random plane and no idea where that plane might even take us, it would be really unsettling. And so for children, the notion around having a routine that they understand, either through their own cognitive abilities or because you've mapped it out visually for them, is a really important way of de-escalating anxiety and stress in children. And staying really positive. I mean, working with some children's behaviours can be quite stressful, particularly if they're high-end behaviours like aggression. It can be, you can often feel that parents feel that they're in the trenches with that behaviour, but with some simple approaches, you can actually reclaim the sorts of relationships with children that are really helpful and positive moving forward. And remember that you've got a leadership space with children, and most parents have actually really got this. 85 to 90% of all children will understand the rules of engagement in the social world with these strategies that we're about to talk about. It's not overly hard. It's a time investment for you, for sure, but you don't need to have a master's degree in behavioural science to to help your children to be socially successful. You need some basic foundational understandings and consistency in how you're talking to your children about learning the right types of behaviour. We've spoken about the need to always speak to the behaviour that you're seeking, not the behaviour that you want to stop. It's a really important strategy and it's a game changer. So if you've got children who are non-compliant, children who do things and you go like, why on earth are you doing that? The more specific about the target behaviour that you want to see you can be, the better. When we're talking about rules and social behaviours, another framework that you really need to understand is, what does my expectation look like, sound like and feel like? So what does listening to me look like? How would you describe to a child what does listening to someone actually really look like? Yeah, and when you start to sort of say, so instead of saying things like listen, or that really unhelpful sort of stuff, what's your little one's name? Hunter. Remember our rule, when I'm talking I need you to look at me in the face and turn your face to me so you can listen. So you start to show the child what the behaviour actually looks like, sounds like and feels like. Has anyone here had a new bubby come home and you spend the first 3 months sort of saying to the older child, be gentle with the baby? And their idea of gentle and your idea of gentle can be poles apart. So that's another really lovely example of taking your expectation and actually splitting it apart for a little one so that they understand, what does gentle feel like? What does it look like? Does gentle look like sitting beside the baby, not on top of the baby? Does gentle hands mean that our hands are always open palm? They're the sorts of things that as the adult, the behavioural coach, you need to think about, because the clearer it is in your mind, the easier it is for you to talk to the child about it in ways that are really helpful. Using visual cues, even in the adult world, the power of using visual cues is really quite profound. Have you ever met a 2-year-old in a Western country that doesn't know what the golden arches mean? They all do, because the visual cueing for that is really something that's a powerful tool. Even for adults, when we go into a new venue, even if it's in a foreign country, we look for the visual cueing for things like bathrooms. If you've ever bought anything from IKEA, if you couldn't understand the visual cueing, you're up Ditch Creek. You're not going to get that flat pack piece of furniture put together without following the visual cueing. For children, the notion around visual cueing gives them a reference point and a reminder of all the conversations that you should have had with your child around what does the behaviour look like, sound like and feel like. If you just use a graphic like walking feet and haven't spent the time in conversation with children about that's what you do when you're inside the house, that visual cue is not going to mean anything because it hasn't yet made the link to a reference point for the child. But as soon as you've had the conversation around when we're inside, we use our walking feet, and these are what walking feet look like and sound like, then the next time that the child starts to run in the house, you can go, no, stop. Remember, what is our rule about walking feet? And they should be able to retell that to you. So this is a way of getting in front of the ball, reinforcing the right behaviours and giving your child a chance to actually be in control of their own emotions and their behavioural responses to things. And you can apply the visual cueing to just about every single sort of behaviour and rule that you could think of. And it's worth absolutely thinking about the power of visual cueing. So the other thing that's really important and often gets missed by adults when they're working with children with big behaviours is the notion of practice outside of the behavioural moment. If we think about behaviour as being a whole set of skills that get buckled together to form the social behaviour. Let's take sharing, for instance. How many component parts do you think are involved? Component skills that are involved for a little one to share. There's about 5, right? To be able to share, I need to be able to read the visual cue that you've got something and I have to negotiate with you to get it, right? I then have to have the skill of asking for that. Can I have a turn? I then have to have the skill of being able to wait for that reciprocal interactions between the person I want to share things from. And then I have to be confident enough to actually give it back, because that's not, if it don't give it back, it's not called sharing, that's just called stealing. So there's all of those skill sets that children have to learn and put them together in the right sequence for the behaviour to be right. So if we don't let children practice those skills outside of the time that we're expecting them to share, we're reducing their ability to be successful. The strike rate gets really, really low, and they learn by accident rather than by intent, which is really important differential, right? Some children are going to learn pretty easily, we know, but some little ones will need some extra help. So if your little one is struggling with a behaviour, this is really important that we look at how we practice that. With really little children, we're so fortunate because the practice we just wrap up in the form of a game, much like you do with sport. Make it fun, make it a game, and make it outside of the behavioural stressor that your child is struggling with. So for instance, if you've got a little one who struggles to go to the supermarket without having a temper tantrum, has anyone had experience with that? If we pretend at home we're getting ready to go to the supermarket, and you can act as a behavioural coach and unpick all the things that are going to happen before you go to the shopping centre. When you go to the shopping centre for real, your child has had a chance to sort of practice the skills, and you've got the opportunity to remind them of the things that they did during the practice. And my question to educators and parents is always around this. If you think about the Australian ballet, or you think about the football teams like the Broncos or our national football teams, how good do you think they would be if the only time that they strapped on a ballet shoe or picked up a football was on match day? They wouldn't, right? And it's the same when we're talking about behaviour, particularly for little ones. Any behaviours that they're finding difficult, you really have to find the space and the time to allow them to practice what good looks like and what they need to do to be socially successful. That also counts for emotional responses, right? It's no good in a child in the height of a temper tantrum to say to them, "You're fine, calm down," or "knock it off." So there's no reference point for those children, and it's not much, it shouldn't come as a great surprise to us that they really struggle in those sorts of events. Language with little ones really, really counts a lot when we're dealing with behaviour. And if you take nothing away from this little session other than this one, that's a good thing. Really try to avoid asking children why they're behaving in any particular way at all times, because most of the time children won't know why they're behaving in a certain way. If you say, why on earth did you do that? Why on earth were you rough with your brother? They won't be able to tell you. But what you replace the why questions with are what, when and how. And if you've done the groundwork with your rules and routines around what are your behavioural expectations, your child will have a really good chance of being able to stop, rethink what they're doing, and alter the course of their behaviour. So if we take being rough, for example, instead of saying to Rebecca, "Why are you being rough with your baby sister?" replace that with, "Stop, Rebecca, what should we be doing when we're playing with the baby? How do we treat the baby when we're playing with the baby?" So that you're prompting them to think back to the conversations and the practices that you've had around the very thing that you're trying to land. So what, when and how are really important pieces of language to replace when you're dealing with children's behaviour. You can ask your little one all the why questions when it's not a behavioural episode. You can ask why the sun might rise in the east and set in the west to your heart's content. You might ask them, why does ice melt to water? Every day of the week, if that's something that your child's interested in. But during a behavioural episode, avoid asking why, because it's not helpful. And the other thing that's a really important little tip is avoid saying please. If you're clear about your expectations with little ones, then don't ask please at the end of a sentence, and it's really seductive thing to do with children. So when you sort of say, "Can you go and tidy up your room, please?" When you put please at the end of a sentence, what does it allow children to consider? Choice. And that's okay if they have choice. But if you absolutely don't want them to have a choice, if they absolutely have to go to bed, then all you need to do is swap the please for thank you. It's time to go to bed. Can you go to bed, please? Replace it with, it's time to go to bed. Thank you. When you're saying thank you, you're sending really subtle but powerful language messages to your child that you're so confident that they're going to comply to your request. You're thanking them in advance. It sounds like a really simple thing, but I'm telling you right now, it's actually pretty powerful. If you've got children who are really oppositional, you know, they're the little ones that if you say it's time to be outside, they want to be inside. If you say something's black, they say it's white. You know, those little children that, you know, just really stretch our tolerance levels. Wanting to be the master of their own domain is actually a really healthy, normal part of becoming a grown-up human being. So that sense of autonomy, being able to make choices and decisions for yourself is really, we want that for our children. But for some children, they need to exercise and flex their ability to make those decisions much more than other children. And so they'll often be making those decisions at the wrong time when it doesn't suit the adults who are charged with their care and custody. So these two little strategies are really helpful for those children, because when you've got those oppositional children, what is the one word that is like a red flag to the bull? It's no, you can't do that. No, you're not doing that. And then we see the behaviour really escalate in those situations. So a really helpful strategy is this notion around conditional consent and restricted choice. So when I say conditional consent, that's like we have a little person and they're saying, I want to watch TV and it's time to brush teeth and whatever it might be. I want to watch TV, and you say, no, you can't, it's time to brush our teeth. The normal thing would be that behaviour would escalate pretty rapidly. So instead of saying no, you can say, yes, you can absolutely watch TV as soon as you have cleaned your teeth. So the yes when, after then, those sorts of things. I want to go outside to play. Yep, not a problem. You just have to clean up the playroom first. So you avoid saying no, but you're not avoiding the child being compliant to what you're seeking. Does that make sense? Yep. And the restricted choice piece is around, again, those same little ones. If you say, this is the t-shirt you're wearing today, they will want to wear the lace tutu, because just to be, you know, challenging. So for those little ones, the ability to make choices is really, really important. So instead of having, this is what you're going to wear, ask yourself, what are the 3 things that I could live with if the child chose out of those 3 things? And then give the child those 3 things and said, so you're providing the guide rails around choice that you can live with, but you're still allowing your little person the ability to make choice, because for them that's a really important part of how they feel good about themselves. And we all like to feel that we're in control, right? At some point it's really important for our well-being. So for these children, that's a really, really helpful little strategy. Follow up and follow through always. Don't write checks with your mouth that your body cannot pay. So don't say to children, if you're going to be good at grandma's, we're going to go to SeaWorld, when you know you're not going to go to SeaWorld. Don't promise things that are going to be difficult for you to live with. Don't promise overt rewards that you can't do. And equally, don't threaten things that you can't follow through. So and I don't mean threatening in a punitive way, but if you're saying that the consequence for non-compliance might be that you're not going to be able to play on the iPad for the rest of the day because you were not listening to me, and that's an agreed process before we get to that point, don't then wait 2 hours and give the iPad back. Because when we don't follow through, children learn not to trust what's coming out of our mouth. And they learn that if they push a little bit harder, mum and dad are going to cave. And they're going to, so it sets up a really toxic cycle with children. So it's okay to downgrade what the follow through is going to be to something that you can live with. And the follow through and reward piece is often time spent in relationships with children. Children don't necessarily want to go to SeaWorld, but they would give their eye teeth to go to the park with you on a Saturday afternoon instead. And following up is where we need to take the time to check back in with them and sort of say, I really like the way that you tried to be gentle, or that you tried to share, or that you tried to use your big boy words. you need to make sure that you're actually acknowledging the efforts that children make, much like you would be in a workplace. If your direct manager provides you with little or no feedback around how your performance at work is going, it's demoralising. And the same is very true for children. Learning how to be socially responsible in behaviours is really hard work for some children. And the efforts that they make need to be recognised by the adults that are working with them. And if we look at, if we think about a behavioural episode, we need to look for the teachable moments. So behaviour escalates and then de-escalates. And the types of interactions that we do at the ramp up and ramp down of behaviour is really important. So on the ramp up, the follow-up is about making sure we're giving children real reminders about what are the things that they should be thinking about doing. What is the target behaviour that you spent time talking about? And on the ramp down, it's about the debrief. What went well? What didn't go so well? And how do we reset the plan next time for better success? So when we're talking about putting a plan in action for a child, whether it's written down or whether it's verbal, these are some of the things that really help. So making sure that you're talking about the behaviour that you want to see with your little one, making sure it's kept really simple. Keep it really visual, particularly for young children. Make sure that the target behaviour, your children know exactly what the behaviour looks like, sounds like and feels like. And make sure that the plan is really open for the child, they're accessible for the child, and that we're talking about the plan a lot as we're heading into potentially stressful situations. And make sure that you celebrate success. Make sure you take the time to actually stop and smell the roses when your child does something that they've been struggling with for a little while. So that's an example of a written plan. So you can see if we're talking about gentle hands, we're scripting what the gentle hands specifically are. We've got the icon around what does gentle hands look like. And then we've got a bit of a plan around reward and recognition. So, and remember, the recognition doesn't have to be commercial or tangible. It can be just time spent at the park or playing bingo, or I'll build Lego with you, but it's about making sure that it's recognised and rewarded. It's about seeing yourself as an adult almost like a football coach. When you're working with children's behaviour, you need to go in with the support plan. You need to be able to make sure that the child knows what the plan is. You need to check that the child understands the plan. Be ready to go back in at half time and recalibrate the plan and make sure that we're on track, much as you would if you were playing a sporting game. And show confidence that you believe that the child can be successful. No football coach has a team that believes that their football coach is actually working for the opposition. Right? Your child needs to believe that you have faith in their ability to be socially successful. And let the child know that you're on their side. Often when I work with educators and parents, the fractured relationship between a child and an adult gets in the way. And that it's almost like a feudal mentality that can ensue with really high-end behaviours. But as the caring adult for young children, you have to flip that mindset and you have to make sure that you're invested in the relationship. No child will change their behaviour for someone that they don't feel is invested in the relationship. And if anyone's ever tried to break a behaviour themselves, whether it be smoking or being on a diet or whatever that behaviour might be, you know how critically important it is to have someone who is your mentor and support in changing behaviour. And for young children, it's their parents and their teachers that have to view that as part of their role. So part of that is about making sure that we catch them being good. So if we're talking about a balanced diet of feedback for young children, for every time we have to have a crucial conversation with a child about what's not acceptable, we need to counterbalance that with about 4 times the number of conversations around letting them know that they are on the right track. And finding, no child can be actually terrible all day. It's not possible. So finding the moment, being aware of the moments and catching them being good is a really powerful counterbalance strategy for the times when we have to get serious with children. What do you see? Can you tell me what you see? A black dot, a circle? Yeah. So in actual fact, that's a black circle inside of a great big white square. And it's the same with children's behaviour. No child is completely defined by their behaviour. There is lots of things that make up children and how they operate in the social world and within relationships. And when we start to only focus on the dot, we start to lose sight of who that person really is, and it diminishes our ability to actually work constructively and proactively with the whole person when we're only focused on the dot. And I have to then share with you that one of my gorgeous colleagues many years ago did the next thing. She said, yeah, but this kid's dot's that big. and that might be true. You might have a lot of things to deal with, but no matter how big the dot, there's still other things that make up that child beyond the behaviour. So thank you for hanging in on all of the overt noise. I hope there was at least a couple of things in there that you can take and try. They are really tried and tested and evidence-based strategies. So good luck with your little person. Thank you very much. Thank you.